Are we green? I think we're green. Okay, so here I am. Welcome to the channel. Welcome back. Welcome if you are new. I'm going to talk about the end of civilization. It's related to climate change and global heating. I've mentioned many times on this channel that the way we're doing things, this current system, which is just a broad way of talking about all the things that we're currently doing. Western industrialized civilization. I've said many times, and others have said in like manner, that this cannot go on, that this civilization is doomed. And, of course, all civilizations eventually reach their demise, right? We only have one really dominant civilization on the planet right now, and that's not too uncommon, especially when that civilization has really enveloped and in its own way conquered the entire planet and all the humans that live on it. So it's not too surprising that here we are, right? Western industrialized civilization, and the claim is that it's going to end, that it must end, and there's no way to avoid that. That's an easy thing to say. People have said that before. People have, studied religious texts or spiritual texts and said, here, you see, this passage right here says that the world is going to end, and these are the conditions wherein the world will end, and these are the signs of the times, and blah, blah, blah. Whatever, a comet will cross the sky, or an alien spacecraft will land on Earth, or there will be an antichrist, or there will be an earthquake, or there will be a plague, or something. There's always some reason why the world was going to end. It never does, of course, because those things are all bullshit. But there is a reason why this civilization is going to end. As all have ended, and this one will end too, for its own reasons, unique to the current situation. Fairly unique, actually. There aren't too many other civilizations that have existed on Earth that have been in this exact situation and in this precarious and unstable of a situation. Our doom can almost be calculated. The way that we are set up to fail, and we are set up to fall. And it's as simple as that. I can stop there. And if you think that's a load of hooey, you could leave now if you want. Before you do, give me a like. You may want to subscribe for more hooey later on. Or you can hang on, and I will explain exactly why I believe this isn't going to work. First of all, why would we even care? Why would anybody care if the world is going to end? If the world is going to end, then I guess it ends for everybody, and then we're all in the same sorry state, and we'll figure out another way to do things. Yes, and we will suffer losses if we take that approach. The Greeks invented certain things, but they wrote them down, so we didn't lose them. The Romans invented certain things, and they wrote them down, so we didn't lose them. But we are in a very difficult position right now. The things that we have created will not survive very long past this civilization's demise. These things have, and they probably cannot ever be reproduced. The Roman aqueducts are still there. And if you wanted to repair one of the Roman aqueducts, you could just get some stone and carve it using relevant tools and replace the stones, and you'd have the Roman aqueducts back. The Roman roads still exist. The Roman walls still exist. And if you wanted to repair those things or get them back into shape for later use, you could certainly do that. If you wanted to make new ones just like them someplace else, you could certainly do that using the existing Roman walls and aqueducts and roads as examples, because they're still there. Even after 1,500 years, they're still there. So that's not going to work with what we have. Some of the knowledge may go forward, but how are you going to maintain or reproduce a microchip fab, assuming you personally even know what that is. That has what we call path dependency. That came about through a long series of events that you would have to repeat. And you would have to have all the same resources and all the same people and all the same industries. And they'd all have to be there for you to reproduce, recreate, even fix, maintain an existing microchip fab, which most of them of consequence are actually not even in the United States of America. And if they are, they're not in every town and city. So you'd have to go find them, and you'd have to repair them, and you wouldn't have the tools, and you wouldn't have the knowledge, and you wouldn't have the techniques or the equipment or the resources or anything because of path dependencies. So where we are is a very unique place in human history. Well, we have built, which is absolutely amazing, we built through a particular series of steps, and those steps would have to be repeated, and the resources would have to be available. And if I'm right, they won't be. So what we have now is all we're going to have. If we lose it, it's gone. And that's the difference this time around. If you like the things that you have all around you, all this modernity, then you need to start paying attention. And this is a place where leadership needs to start paying attention. As our Titanic sinks, they will be in a position to try and preserve some of this. But let me just talk now about how we got where we are. And when I speak to how we got where we are, then you might better understand why this is in a particularly fragile state. I want to start. Okay, I'm going to go to my other screen here. Here we are. Where's my mouse? There it is. I'm going to go here. This is they're calling this in the long run, that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek joke. The bottom scale here goes back 10, I'm going to put my glasses back on, goes back 10,000 BC, okay, up to 2000 AD. And what this is this is world population. Most people have never seen this chart. This is, but the people who have seen this chart and understood it find it flabbergasting. This is what happened. Somewhere in this timeline are the Greeks. Somewhere in this timeline are the Romans. They're not even a bump on this chart. The line that goes up, and there is a line on the right of this chart that goes straight up like a rocket shot, is us. That's us. It's mostly really since the year, I would say, 1800. So not living memory. Well, it started in 1800. Most of it has been really since in my lifetime. I was born in 1959. So 1960, there was 3 billion people, and now there's 8 billion people in 2023. Okay, and the rest of that are projections up to 2036 and 2058. We'll probably never see those numbers. We might see 9 billion, but I seriously doubt it. So one of the things that happened that got us where we are right now is this chart. The human population has exploded. That's not a bad thing if it can be managed. It exploded for, and by the way, I don't really consider this a problem by itself. Some people do. Some people think it's the basis for our demise, but it's not the basis for our demise. There's nothing in this chart that's particularly bad or alarming. It's interesting. I think you have to say this chart is interesting. That really most of the growth of the human population occurred since the year 1900. That's interesting. And then you may ask yourself, why was that the case? What changed suddenly that, between the 14th century and the 20th century, in that 600-year period, something happened that allowed us to do what we have done. Didn't happen any other time. Even during the Greeks and even during the Romans and even with the aqueducts and the Roman roads and the Roman legions and all that, we still didn't have this happen. This is new. This is us. This is our civilization did this. And how did this happen? Well, some of it was innovation. I would say a lot of it actually was innovation. I don't think it would have. I don't. If some of these innovations hadn't happened, I don't think it would have made a difference. The innovations that are important, but probably would not have made a real difference, are things like indoor plumbing, meaning sewer treatment, right? Electricity, modern transportation. So you don't have to ride a horse; you can ride on a train or drive a car. These things are all very important. Penicillin, reductions in childhood mortality, more freedom for women, and a bunch of other things. The end of slavery, just a bunch of other things allowed this chart to go up like this, starting at about the year 1900. But all the things I mentioned are not really that important. What really allowed this is not innovation, unless you want to account for an innovation that happened back in like the year 8000 BC. Okay? What happened in about the year 1900 forward was the copious and ready availability of food. Food does more to determine family size than almost anything else. Yes, of course, you can't have large families unless you reduce infant mortality. But a large part of infant mortality is starvation. People used to live on the edge of starvation all the time. And there's a little known practical reality, which is that women need to be healthy to have offspring at all. There's a kind of a built-in fail-safe, where if a woman isn't finding enough food to maintain about 50% body fat, maybe a little lower than that, maybe 35 or 40% body fat, then she can't reproduce. And that's actually really important, because children, even just pregnancy, takes a lot of resources. And if women were, quote unquote, allowed to get pregnant when they themselves are unhealthy, they haven't had enough food to eat, or they've been harassed too much, or the weather hasn't been particularly healthy, or there's been too much diseases and she's been sick for many years, whatever the problem is, then she can't, then allowing her to have children would cause her to die, and you wouldn't have women, females. And if she did manage to get pregnant, but she couldn't feed, keep herself and her unborn child alive, they would both die, and you're right back where you started. So the fact that women, the observation, the understanding that women really need a lot of body fat to have enough estrogen to go through their fertility cycle is really critical. And one of the reasons that kept the human population from taking off was simply women didn't have enough to eat, or they were sick too often, or child rearing was too complicated and demanded too many resources, and they were thin, and they weren't fertile. And that's probably how it should be, because you wouldn't want to have a lot of children that you couldn't feed, right? So a big part of this chart taking off was simply the fact that women had plenty to eat. It's as simple as that. And why not? Why shouldn't women have lots to eat? And children too, right? We want our children to be happy and healthy and robust and growing, and we want our women to be exactly the same way. And a woman wants to have 6, 8, 10, 12 kids. Sure, she can do that. And it's good that there's less infant mortality, but the fact that she can have a child pretty much anytime she wants to is a big part of 8 billion people since the year 1900. Food, which is a good thing. And I'm not saying that having plenty of food is a bad thing. We've even got so much food that obesity is becoming a problem. And obesity is even a problem in places that historically, didn't have much food. So, I guess it's a good problem to have, right? As opposed to the alternative, which is people that are skinny and emaciated and women that can't conceive. So this is what has happened. We have gone from, the Greeks and the Romans, who were never that abundant, right? They're here on the map. You don't see a big spike. We went from the Greeks and the Romans to a period of time when we really solved the food problem. We solved the food problem. But according to this chart, and if you buy my notion that this chart reflects the availability of food, and maybe a few other things that made life nice, but mostly the availability of food. I mean, for example, penicillin wasn't even discovered until, in the mid 1900s, right? Okay, so we didn't have antibiotics until fairly recently. So why was this chart going up? Starting in 1800s, 1850s? Well, yeah, because we didn't have electricity, we didn't have internet, we didn't have penicillin, there was still lots of wars. We were still having plagues, right? And people were still moving around the planet trying to find places to live. And we were invading other continents and killing those people, and all these wars in Europe and all these wars in China. And then we still started, the human population started to increase. Because those things weren't holding us back. Food was holding us back. And when we figured out how, innovated a little bit, there were some innovations in agriculture. But a lot of it started back in the 8000 BC. So, that wasn't enough, obviously. And here we are. So what has changed? And that's my point. Something changed. And the thing that changed cannot happen again. That was a one-shot. That was a one-off. We may stay 8 billion people. But I think that the thing that got us to 8 billion people from, say, 1 billion, back in the year 1600 or so, I guess on this chart, maybe 1800. The thing that got us to 8 billion people is also going to bring us back to 1 billion people. And likely, speaking now as a biologist, as a, ecosystem biologist, we're probably going to crash through 1 billion, which, was where we were in the year 1800. We're going to crash through 1 billion and go back to a much, much smaller number. And I'll explain why in a minute. But before I do that, let me explore my thesis that there's a reason why we are where we are, 8 billion people. And there's a reason why we can't stay at 8 billion people, and why we probably can't even be 800 million people, possibly maybe 80 million people. And it's this chart right here. Now, this chart does not go back to 10,000 BC, but it doesn't need to, because you'll see that everything that happens on this chart starts in about the year 1850. And that's right. That's modernity. That's the Western industrialized civilization that we are all now part of. All of us are now part of that. You'd have to find some isolated tribe in Amazonia to find a group of people that's not part of Western industrialized civilization. And the thing that happened in 1850, when we were, still knocking at around 1 billion people, is the thing that made us have so many people. And it's that we found new forms of energy. Now, I'm just going to walk through this chart real quick from the bottom to the top. And you can see this chart here that pops up. The bottom part of this is what we call traditional biomass, the brown part. And it's appropriate that it's brown because it's basically wood. People also burn other plant matter. People also burn other plant matter like straw and even animal cow pies and horse manure. There's enough energy left in those to even be burned. And they still burn these things in India, for example. Poor people living in the countryside burn the cow pies. But you'll notice it's kind of a flat line. Yeah, we've gotten better about collecting wood. We have chainsaws now and heavy equipment to collect wood. But there's other things we can burn. We don't have to burn wood. And, some places they still burn wood. There are people living up in the mountains that buy a bunch of wood to burn all winter, because it's cheaper for them to heat with wood. And, so it's gone up a little bit, but it hasn't doubled since the year 1800. It pretty much has been a constant. The thing that has made a big difference for us is my point here, and the point of this chart is these other things that have happened since then, which we will be exploring momentarily. These are the things that have happened since then that led to the increase in human population to 8,000 million people, which I don't consider a problem all by itself. It's simply evidence that something changed. And let's just take it at that. Okay. If you think 8,000 million people is a big problem, I guess you're entitled to think whatever you like. There are population economists and population biologists who think that the carrying capacity of the world for humans is closer to 20 billion people. And once people leave the planet and start living out in space or on other planets, then there is no upper limit to how many humans there can be. We could have another billion people on Mars. We could have 10, 12 billion people living on Earth. We could have billions of people living, on the Jovian moons. Who the heck knows? It's all science fiction, of course, but it's only fiction until it's not. So 8,000 billion is not the problem. If we could just keep increasing our availability of these energy resources like coal, oil, and natural gas, then we can, and you'll see that each of these is getting bigger, right? This chart's kind of in the way. But look at coal, right? Coal, you have to go way back here to find where coal kind of becomes a deal. Here we are. About the year 1850, the coal band starts to get wider. And, that's the era of steam, right? Steam locomotives, they threw coal in the firebox. And steam engines in factories, they threw coal into the firebox. And coal really jump-started this entire industrialized revolution. There was so much energy in coal that we could work metal like we never worked metal before. It takes a lot of heat to melt iron and smelt iron out of ore, and then to melt it and pour it and cast it and hammer it. And it takes so much energy to do this. And it was just completely impossible. It's just ludicrous to make anything other than nails and plowshares and maybe some fancy swords or armor or something out of iron before the Industrial Revolution. This is ridiculous. And you had to burn trees. And they burned a lot of trees, man. Europe used to be covered in trees. The UK used to be covered in trees. And you can't find those forests anymore, except that, we stopped burning them and they started to grow back. People burned trees to work iron. And when they found coal, and cutting down trees and splitting them up and hauling them here and converting them into charcoal and doing these other things, it takes a lot of manpower, a lot of animals, a lot of miles traveled. And as the forest became further and further removed from the places of industry, then you had to have more commitment to transportation of your forests, and it was just a mess. And if they hadn't discovered coal, it probably would have all collapsed in on itself. The Industrial Revolution would have ended. I don't know, maybe the year 1900, it would have just ended. But sometime in 1850 or so, they discovered coal, and they started using coal instead. They almost quit using wood, and they used coal instead. And the prevalence of coal in our energy mix really took off, and it's still growing to some extent. You'll see there's been kind of a plateau since the years 2005, 2010 in coal production. But that's because, why did coal production plateau? Well, that's because we discovered the energy available in crude oil, which is much more flexible. You can, in truth, coal by weight contains more actual energy than oil or natural gas by weight, and coal is much easier to transport, and it's has other, it's a stone, you can store it easily, but oil as a liquid is so much easier to use for other things, and you can distill it. You can make fuels out of it, and you can make industrial materials out of it, the things that go into plastics, for example. And many pharmaceuticals come from oil. Benzene, which is critical for organic chemistry, comes from oil. And so our discovery of oil and discovering also how to use it and manipulate it and break it down and reformulate it is allowed industrialized civilization to really take off. Coal jump-started that, but crude oil, really took it to the next level. And then there's natural gas, which is also growing in prevalence in our energy mix. Constantly since shortly after we discovered oil, we discovered natural gas. In fact, you really get one without the other. You get one with the other. The natural gas is usually found with the oil, and you hit the gas before you hit the oil. They stack. But we didn't have a use for the gas. We didn't really know what to do with it. So we just vented it into the atmosphere. Later on, when they found uses for it, they started going to the trouble of capturing it and putting it in pipelines. You can transport oil in a truck, but you can't transport natural gas in a truck. You have to transport natural gas in pipelines. So when they discovered it had some utility, and they said, well, we can build the pipelines, so let's just do that. Then they started building pipelines, and now we have natural gas in abundance. Natural gas isn't as flexible as crude oil. It can be used to make fertilizers, which is important to our agricultural explosion. And you can use natural gas to make electricity, which is also important to our explosion. Much of what makes human life feasible at these levels of, billions is electricity. And then other things in the list, you'll notice that after natural gas, everything else is like insubstantial. You could almost lose them completely, and you might not even know. And what are those things? Well, they're here on the you'll see them on the right. The nuclear, hydropower, which is water, a tiny little sliver for wind, okay, a tiny little sliver for solar, and then modern biofuels. This is to make a distinction between traditional biomass, which remember was way down here, this traditional biomass. And then there's modern biofuels and renewables, other renewables. So this whole stack here, starting with nuclear and then hydropower and then wind, you could almost just slice it off and do without. We're glad to have it. And just let me make a real quick case. When we can't have natural gas, oil, and coal anymore, then the stack will collapse to just the top, nuclear and above, and back to traditional biomass. We'll still be able to have traditional biomass because that's trees. And you can always plant trees. They grow slowly, and they're not real flexible. Yeah, you can make lumber and furniture out of them, and of course you can burn them for energy. So, but if the rest of the stack collapses, coal, oil, and natural gas, we are well and truly fucked. We truly are. And going back to this other chart, notice how this chart, which has this population explosion, right around 1800, look how nicely that overlaps with this. Okay? Correlation is not causation, but it's very easy to make a case, as I have, that it's not innovation and it's not inventions and it's not exploration or colonialization or even industrialization that has gotten us where we are. It's food. It's food. And we now make more food than people can eat. And I know there's starvation, but that malnutrition and starvation is a first world problem. We could solve that easily. We really could. And they'll tell you, a third of food goes to waste. Yeah, when you peel an apple, that's waste, right? But if you had pigs, you could feed the pigs the apple peeling, so you wouldn't even waste that. But the problem is not waste. The problem is distribution. We have a lot of food that if it goes to waste, it goes to waste in the silos. We just didn't have the political wherewithal to move it to where it needed to be. If we have waste, it's because farm subsidies don't give farmers the right price, so they just pour the milk or whatever, they pour the milk in the ocean and they set fire to the grain and they kill the cattle. I mean, that's a lot of waste, right? But that's all politics. That's just capitalism fucking around with food. And that's why we can't feed people. If we really wanted to feed people, we could feed people. And we could go from 8,000 million people, this chart, we could go from 8,000 million people to 10,000 million, 10 billion, right? 10 billion, 12 billion, 15 billion. Just feeding more people. Just making sure that women are healthy and children live longer and people get better educations. It's hard to get educated when you're hungry and your brain isn't working correctly. And we could have more people, and those more people could be smarter, and they could do more innovation and whatever else could come from that. But it all starts with food, right? Food. And this chart is about food from energy. Now I mentioned natural gas being used to make fertilizer. I don't know where a percentage of this natural gas slice goes into fertilizer, but it doesn't matter. It's however much fertilizer we want and need. There's plenty of natural gas, and we could just make all the fertilizer we can imagine. And that goes right into the fields. Every grain of it goes into the fields. And then the other thing the natural gas does for us is, of course, by and large, it's used to make electricity. And that electricity, it's used to pump water and refrigerate food for transportation and refrigerate it at the destination. Electricity in copious amounts is used at slaughterhouses to butcher the animals and then to freeze the carcasses and put them in the freezer trucks and then drive them around the countryside to the freezers at your local supermarket. You don't have a butcher in your community. You don't have a cattle yard. You don't have pasture, and they don't turn out the cows to eat in the morning and bring them in at night. They don't milk them in the morning. Your milk doesn't come from your community. Everything I just mentioned and more, much more, thousands of other things just from animals, thousands of things just from animals travel or produce thousands of miles away and travel thousands of miles to get to your supermarket. And your supermarket runs with electricity. Almost every single thing in there, except the people who stock the shelves. Everything in the supermarket is powered by electricity. And a lot of that electricity comes from some combination of either natural gas or coal and, a certain amount of nuclear and wind and solar and some other things. But you'll see from this chart that those things don't even count. You could lose everything from nuclear above. You could lose it all completely. And that would only take you back to, where would we be? Where would we be if we lost everything except hydro? Right about here, I guess. Right about there. The year 2000. You're right about the year 2000. If you lost that whole stack except for hydro, you'd be back around the year 2000. I'm allowing for hydro because most of the dams that are being used to generate electricity were made in the 1950s, right? So we already had them. And the hydro pie piece doesn't change in size much. You notice that there's a point where it's just kind of the same. There's a little bit of an increase, but there's not a lot. It doesn't even double between wherever this is, 1920 to 2023. It doesn't even, hardly doubles in that amount of time. And you have to go way back. You have to go way back to even have this even show up. 1950, before hydro even shows up, really. Seriously, there's really nothing here. There's nothing here. By 1950, these other things start to take off. Nuclear, hydro, a bunch of other things. And of course, solar and wind and other renewables are Johnny-come-latelys, pretty much since 2010. So they contribute nothing to our current situation. They contribute nothing to our current situation of vulnerability. The main contributors to our current situation of vulnerability consist entirely, completely of coal, oil, and natural gas. With hydro and nuclear maybe since 1950 making a little bit tiny of a difference. And that's about it. Nothing else matters. We have gotten where we are because of fossil fuels. We have gotten where we are because of fossil fuels. And what is that again? This. This happened because of fossil fuels. Coal initially, and then oil, and then shortly after that, natural gas. This happened because of fossil fuels. This line, this rocket shot, starting in 1700, but certainly since then, this moonshot is fossil fuels. There is some modernity that made a bit of a difference. Why did I do that? Oh, my mouse. There has been some improvements in modernity. We probably would have plateaued at about 1 billion in the year 1800 had it not been for the discovery of coal and its principal properties. And what got us to that point? A lot of it was colonialism. A lot of it was finding new land to exploit. A lot of it was, driving native peoples off of their land and conquering them and then using their land to make more food. So some pretty outlandish and, unacceptable criminality got us to 1 billion in about the year 1800. But prior to that, before we could sail the oceans and navigate freely, and if we had steel to make swords and muskets and bullets and gunpowder, before we had all that, the population really couldn't get much above, I don't know, what's this dot down here? 190 million? Why does it keep doing that? 190 million. Yeah, right about here. 190 million at about 190 million. This is year zero. Yeah, okay. So pretty much the population was stable up until about the year zero, right, 2,000 years ago. And then it kind of started to increase due to nastiness, criminality, and it probably would have stabilized at about 1 billion people, just based on criminality, which is not sustainable, by the way. You can only conquer so many continents. You can only genocide so many native peoples and take their land for your own purposes before you can't do that anymore. And one of the reasons that Europeans left Europe and began exploring the world, and the English left England and started exploring the world, is because they had basically destroyed their habitat. They cut down all the forests, and they used the wood to make ships, and they used the wood to make charcoal, to make more steel. And between the ships and the steel and the cannons, which are made of iron and bronze, right? Between the ships and the steel and the cannons and the gunpowder, they could keep the show going. They could go conquer other lands and destroy other peoples and take their shit. And so they got rich. They became bountiful. They became, the population was able to increase. And, that can only be sustained for so long. Unless you're going to take your ships and your cannons and your gunpowder to Mars, which, by the way, they were fantasizing about, right? In the early 1900s, going to Mars and conquering the Martians. That was science fiction. They were talking about it. It was a topic. So it wasn't like it was completely, out of the realm. This is a chart that's based on this one, except its percentage. So this first brown line is traditional biomass, wood, essentially. And as a percentage, it was close to 100% of human consumption back in the year 1800 of energy resources, 100%, very nearly. But coal had already been discovered and was coming in. And so as you go forward, the amount of wood that is being used is decreasing, and the amount of coal that is being used is increasing. And remember, our population started to take off in about the year 1800, and it probably would not have had we not discovered coal. That's about the time we started replacing wood with coal, which is a fossil fuel. And we had to replace wood with coal because we were cutting down all the forests, and that's just how it was. We cross here in about the year 1900. So the amount of wood being used for energy was decreasing and was being matched by coal by percentage, okay, by percentage. And if we go back to this chart, you'll see in about 1900, yeah, coal and wood are about the same amount. See, that's how you interpret this chart. But the reason why this chart is more important is that the amount of energy goes up. It becomes insane, particularly in 1950. So back here, way back in the day, when wood was 100% of our energy, and not reflexible. What can you do with wood? You can make lumber, you can make houses, you can smelt iron, you can do some things with it. And then with the iron you can innovate with iron, but you don't get much iron working with just wood and charcoal. You need another energy source to get a lot of iron. So they had iron for certain things like swords and muskets and plowshares, and that was derived from using wood. But things really didn't take off until about the year 1900, and then we were deep into steam. We were, going into internal combustion engines in a big way. And when we started doing internal combustion engines, and that's when the oil thing started to take off. So this is an interesting chart in that it's the percentage of these things. And even coal starts to drop down as oil and natural gas begins to come on, right? So once again, coal is now decreasing, but the pink line, which is oil, is now dominant by percent, okay? And natural gas eventually comes along. And natural gas, they're claiming, is set to replace coal as an energy resource. And that might be true in the short run, but I doubt it. I don't think those people have anything to work with. And once again, the percentages down here at the bottom, right? Modern biofuels, other renewables, solar, wind, they don't even count. You could take them out completely and they wouldn't make any difference. And once again, this is fossil fuel consumption. So this is just the fossil fuels. But you derive the same data from this chart. This one removes the stack for everything except coal, oil, and natural gas. It makes it a little more obvious that in 1800 these were nothing burgers. Coal became important in around 1900, and then shortly after that, oil became noticeably important in like the 1920s or so. Hey, we still had militaries operating on coal in the First World War. Not so much the second, but that's the 1940s, right? So oil was a big deal, even to fight war. So back to this. So I want you to consider that Western industrialized civilization is an emergent property of everything else we've done. If we didn't do this, then Western industrialized civilization would not have been a thing. We would have had Western civilization, which is what they called it before. Oh, and by the way, there was a Western civilization, there was African civilization, there was South American civilization, there was North American civilization, there was Eastern civilization in the East, there was civilization in India. The world, up to a point, the world consisted of many concurrent civilizations that didn't even know that the others existed. Their part of the world was well defined by oceans and mountain ranges and enormous rivers and cold areas that you couldn't live in anymore. So you had to stay where it was temperate. And we were bounded by physical barriers. And it wasn't until we overcame physical barriers that Western industrialized civilization grew and dominated. It helped that the English and the Germans and the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Italians were all exporting industrialized civilization during colonial times. They were doing that. They were exporting that. And they exported their cultures, their languages, their religions, while they were exporting their technology. And they were exporting their technology to bring more resources back to the home state. So they got rich from exploiting other countries and people. They used other people to do labor that they didn't want to do. They imported foreign goods, spices, and different types of fruits that were not available, and foods of other types. Of course, with industrialization, you could manufacture luxury goods in huge profusion. So whereas silks used to be a big deal, when the Romans would get a shipment of silk from China, that was a huge deal. Well, now the silk factories produce more silk in a day than the Romans had probably in their entire civilization. Their entire, whatever it was, 800 years of dominating the world. Now modern factories turn out in a day more silk than Rome ever possessed in its entire run. And that's industrialization. So even luxury goods, shoes used to be really rare. Now people get shoes. Everyone can afford shoes. You can get shoes for free from charities. People throw away perfectly good shoes, and not throw away, but they donate them, right? They end up down here at the Goodwill or the Salvation Army or the thrift stop. You can go in there and into a thrift shop and get used shoes that are hardly used at all. Maybe someone wore them once, wore them to the prom, wore them to their wedding, and then they never wore them again, and now they're at the thrift shop. And you go pick them up practically for free, $1 a pair. Things like shoes used to be really rare and expensive. Maybe you had sandals, which was just a little leather, piece of leather that someone cut out of a hide, and then they poked holes in it so you could lace it up around your foot, and you had laces going up your shins, and you had a piece of leather on the bottom of your foot. And that was it. That was a shoe. And that was 8,000 years of shoes. It was just a leather pad that laced up your foot with a thong. And now you can have, there's entire shoe stores. Every shoe store has 100 different types of shoes from 60 different brands. Or maybe 60 brands and 600 shoes. And, simple things like that, which were really rare and really difficult and probably be expensive and didn't last long, or Well, actually, some of the old the old sandals may have lasted longer than our modern shoes because they were made out of heavy leather. But you had to kill an animal, and you had to have a tanner, and the tanner had to deliver the hides to the leather worker, and they would have to cut the leather to the size of your foot, and they'd have to cut the strings out of the leather to tie it up, and blah 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 blah. And before they could figure out tanning and leather in animals, you had to make sandals out of fiber. So you would just find a piece of bark from a suitable tree, and pound it to loosen it up, and use hides from an animal, sinews from an animal to tie it up your foot, and you'd had a bark shoe, and so on. And these days, because of industrialization, the situation is completely turned on its head. I can walk down my street right around here and find a pair of shoes sitting in the bushes. I wouldn't wear them. Probably not my size, but I probably wouldn't wear them just for hygiene reasons. But if it was raining and snowing and my feet were cold, I'd probably put them on, even if they didn't fit that well, right? So we have enjoyed so much gain and wealth enhancement during this period on this chart, starting in really like 1900. This period on this chart, which happens to coincide with this chart. And it's not an accident. Now, I've mentioned path dependency once or twice, and I put it in the description. The path dependency is this. We started out with a very, very simple and limited energy mix. We got our energy directly from the sun by growing plants and eating them and enjoying the energy that we got from the plants, the corn, the potato, the wheat, the whatever. We got energy directly through plants, and we also got energy indirectly through the wind, for example, to turn windmills. And I don't mean the modern windmill that's up on top of the mountain making electricity. I'm talking about just simple windmills that can be used to pump water, turn a millstone. And so we used wind directly to turn a millstone. That allowed us to grind grain, which was great, at more food. And we also used wind directly to sail our ships. Again, very innovative use of wind. Wind was always there. And then we discovered the sail, and we discovered how to make big wooden ships with a lot of wood and big sails, and we could then sail the world. And about the year 1850, our population begins to increase, right? This guy, 1850 is, 1800, 1700, 1800, they're saying there was 990 million people. So we were beginning to increase ourselves. But there's a path dependency to this. In order to get to the point where we have sailing ships, we needed large forests of wood. We needed iron tools, saws, adze, chisels, to convert those trees into planks to make ships. If we hadn't had those forests, we couldn't have made the ships. We couldn't have explored the world. We needed the trees to burn to extract the iron from the iron ore. We then needed wood, frequently more often charcoal, which is just wood that's been processed in a particular way, to work the iron and make iron tools. You have to get iron very hot to work it, and you generally, as a practical matter, you have to have charcoal to do that. Those forests no longer exist. Now, they might in 10,000 years, but right now they don't. Right now, we are really seriously dependent on fossil fuels to continue with what we're doing. We originally discovered fossil fuels basically on the surface of the earth. Coal is a stone. And there were places on earth where you could walk across the ground and pick up a piece of coal. And if you wanted, you could get, tools, picks and shovels, and you could dig the coal out of the ground, just starting on the surface. And there are still places where that's feasible. They're called open cask mines. You basically start digging a hole, and you follow the coal seams down that hole. And it's just a big open pit. And that's basically, of course, now we're using excavators and dump trucks and the whole thing. But that's how we started. Coal was available on the ground. Once. There is no coal available on the ground anymore. That's done. There was once oil available on the ground. You could be walking along the ground, and you could step in it. The La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles contain the remains of all kinds of animals that thought that the tar, or the oil, it's basically just thick oil, was water. And they would wade out into it thinking they were going to drink. And it might even have a layer of water on it from the rain, because water floats on top of this heavy oil tar. And they might think that, oh, well, this is just a pond. I'll just wade out here and have a drink or wash myself. And so the animals would get stuck in the tar, and eventually they would die and they would sink to the bottom. Oil, tar, and all of its other resources was available on the surface of the earth. People avoided it. It's toxic. Plants couldn't grow near it. There's no reason to be there until we discovered that if you set it on fire, it burns. Natural gas was available in much the same way. I think they had to, dig a little bit for it. That's why our exploitation of natural gas came a little later. And of course, you have to have pipelines, and pipes are made out of iron, typically. And so, we had to have a certain level of technology before we could start exploiting natural gas. But still, it was on the surface. You didn't have to dig very much or have much of a pipeline or anything else. And so the coal, the oil, and natural gas was easy to get at one point. And that really jump-started this whole process. We had these fossil fuels that had so much energy density, it was insane. They eclipsed the energy density in wood by orders of magnitude. And it was readily available. As you cut forests, they don't come back. You just keep cutting them. They get further and further away. And so even if you set up your foundry or your smelting area, maybe you set up your iron production where the iron ore is, but probably there was wood nearby too. But as you cut that wood to heat that iron ore to get the iron out, then the forest gets further and further away. So that was not convenient. But coal is abundant lots of places, and when you find it, you find a lot of it, and you can work it with shovels and picks, and you can put it in the back of a truck and transport it anywhere you want. And you can use the coal to power the transportation too, because we discovered, perfected, whatever, steam power running on coal. You can run steam on wood, but it's better if you run it on coal. It's just so much easier. And so all these things built on each other. The easy availability of coal, and then oil, and then later natural gas. These bootstrapped a process. Today, your open cask coal mines are as big as entire counties. They're huge, and they're thousands of feet deep. And the oil, which used to be available on the surface, well, that's all gone. And even the shallow oil is gone. Now we're drilling thousands of feet. We're fracking for oil. We're using enormous equipment and high energy availability to frack for the oil. We're drilling offshore in oceans where you have to go through 20,000 feet of water just to get to the seabed, and then you still got to drill for the oil, and these drilling rigs and all the technology associated with that. It all needs fossil fuels. The open cask mines, the fracking, the drilling in the oceans, the pipelines, everything, all of it needs fossil fuels just to run. So fossil fuels have bootstrapped this process of getting more fossil fuels, going deeper in the ground, going further out in the oceans on the shelves, getting deeper into the rocks with the fracking. And that's where a lot of this growth has happened, is because we're using fossil fuels to create situations where we can get more fossil fuels. And it's, that's a virtuous feedback, but at some point it has to end. And lots of people have been predicting, for example, peak oil, that at some point getting at the oil is going to be more expensive and more time and more energy consuming than you get out of the oil. I don't think that was ever a case. They were always going to get the oil. They were always, whatever it took to get the oil, they were going to get the oil, because oil is the king. Oil makes everything possible. a big part of this chart is actually oil. A large part of this chart is oil, all by itself. The things we can do with oil: to feed people, to house people, to clothe people, to move people around, to fight wars, to innovate in other ways, like, creating microcircuits and computers and the internet and all that stuff. It's all possible because of oil, not because of coal, and not really because of natural gas. It's because of oil. Plastics, for example, come from oil. Probably you could use coal to make plastics. You figure it out, but you'd have to have oil to figure out how to make plastics out of coal. You'd have to have oil to figure out how to make plastics out of natural gas or something else. Synthetic oil. You'd have to have oil to make synthetic oil. That's a dirty little secret. This chart, this explosion, this rocket, this moonshot is because of oil. Now, we have to come back to this chart because this is when I have to give you the bad news. We have to stop burning natural gas, oil, and coal. We must stop doing that. And we will stop doing that. And when we stop doing that, this whole chart is gone. When we can't burn gas, oil, and coal, this whole chart goes to zero or close to it. And that's most of this chart. There's a little bit of traditional biomass, wood, and there's nuclear, hydro, wind, solar. But really, the dirty secret is all of those don't run on wood. You can't have those with just wood. You have solar, wind, hydropower, nuclear with fossil fuels, in particular oil. Modern biofuels are made from agriculture, excess agriculture. Yes, we still have people starving, and yet we can find reasons, however we do that, to turn some of our excess agriculture not into humans or not into, bettering people's lives, but to turn it into fuel, which we then run in our SUVs as we go to Starbucks to get a latte. Yeah, biofuels come from modern agriculture. And where does modern agriculture come from? Some combination of natural gas for fertilizers and oil for the equipment. That's modern agriculture. That's where your excess comes from. So everything in this stack up here, nuclear, hydro, wind, solar, and everything except wood, way down here at the bottom, lonely old wood. Everything else is dependent on the rest of this stack. Natural gas, oil, and coal. And if you remove this whole stack, then all you're left with is wood. That's all you get. That's all you get. And you can't do any of the things with wood that you can do with coal, oil, and natural gas, as a rule. We couldn't even do much industry. There weren't enough trees, and we had cut them all down. And they had to send colonists to the New World to go cut their trees down too. And that was the problem. And if we hadn't discovered coal, the Industrial Revolution would have never taken off. And from that, of course, we discovered oil and natural gas, and then we discovered nuclear and hydro and solar and wind and biofuels and renewables and other stuff, right? Which came along much, much later, like after the year 2000. And oil and natural gas didn't really become a big deal until the 1950s. We were largely coal and a little bit of wood. So without this stack, without all of this becomes impossible. All of this cannot be sustained. Because this is food. And the food doesn't come from wood. With just wood and domesticated animals and domesticated crops and human labor, we couldn't do this. We couldn't do this. And when we are forced to abandon fossil fuels, we won't be able to do this. And when we do abandon fossil fuels, we won't be able to do this again. Because remember, the only reason this started was because coal was available on the surface of the earth, as was the oil. And the natural gas came later, after we were exploiting a buttload of oil and coal. Then we could finally get to natural gas. Without easy availability to these resources. Were you expecting somebody? All right. Someone's at the door. Then we cannot retrace this. We can never do this again. We can never do this again, and we cannot maintain this. Without coal, oil, and natural gas, we're done. We're done. And I've said on this channel many times, there is a 90 to 99% die-off in our future. And this is why. This moonshot, there's a reflection of that. There's another moonshot, a moon crash, where this line goes straight down, back down here. Where at that point, we end up, all we have is basically wood. Wood. And there's, maybe the nuclear power one will continue to run for a while, but nuclear power plants, hydro plants, wind and solar, they all require maintenance, spare parts, okay? Without fossil, if all you have is wood, that's what you're able to burn, if you can find it. So that means you're also planting forests, right? We all become arborists. We have to start maintaining forests. We have to suddenly learn resilience and renewal. The Europeans and the English and all the others, they cut down all the trees to get to the point where they could build enough ships and have enough iron to conquer other nations and cut down all their trees. Well, we can't do that anymore. And if we can't do that anymore, then we can't have sailing ships, and we can't have iron, and we can't have cannons and cannonballs. You can't have any of those things. So you can't have colonialization. All these path dependencies, all the ways we got to the point where we could look at this chart. This is a path dependent chart. We can't reproduce that path. If we are forced to go back basically to wood, there's no way out from wood. And what did we have when we had wood? Well, if we're not willing to cut down every single forest and use them all up, then we don't have large sailing ships. Maybe we have enough ships to, go out and try to catch fish in the ocean. Small ships, fishing boats, right? Fishing boats that are, again, powered by the wind, and not powered by wind power, powered by the actual wind. You can make small ships, and you still have to maintain the forests. And every tree you cut down, you have to plant another one, because that ship eventually has to be replaced. And you realize how precious the wood is, and that's all you've got. You're down here. That's all you got. So why do we have to abandon fossil fuels, and thus everything else in this stack, which cannot be built or maintained or serviced without fossil fuels? Why must we abandon fossil fuels? Well, now we're back to the old argument, and that is global heating. Global heating is caused by, the temperature of the Earth is about 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it should be, in quotes, okay? It's kept warm against other forces of nature, like radiation, black body radiation. The Earth is kept warm by its atmosphere, which contains constituents that act to trap heat. And that's why the atmosphere is warm. It traps heat. And what are those constituents? We call them collectively greenhouse gases, because it's similar to a greenhouse effect. If you build a building out of glass, why would you do that? Well, here's the reason. It lets light in, but it does not let the heat out. And it's called a greenhouse because that's where you put your plants. You don't need greenhouses everywhere. You need greenhouses where you have cold climates and where you want to have lots of plants. And so people who wanted to have plant collections in places like England, where it gets fucking cold and rainy, then they couldn't just have the plants growing outside in the garden. They had to create greenhouses where they could put their exotic plants, and they could have orchids, and they could have every kind of moss and hanging thing, and some parts could even have cactuses. And, you could grow different plants in different parts of the greenhouse, but you could do it in the winter because the light would come in and the heat would not go out. And if you wanted to heat it using, gas or coal or oil or wood or whatever, you could do that too. But the heat would stay in. That's the point. That's the greenhouse. And the earth has a natural greenhouse effect that the light comes in and the heat can't escape quickly. It does eventually, but not quickly. And during the time that the heat is retained, the earth is warmer. And there you go. And so the earth is not a snowball. And the gases in the atmosphere that constitute the assemblage of gases that are part of the greenhouse effect are things like carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, and some other things that in a natural system wouldn't be very prevalent. But those three would be. Carbon dioxide is part of the carbon cycle, so plants and animals are engaging with carbon dioxide all the time. Methane comes from generally decomposition, and there's always living things that are decomposing. So, your swamps, rotting from trees and things like that. More modernly, in more modern times, crop wastes, rice fields, for example, they put out a lot of methane. So methane is associated with plants, and water vapor is associated with evaporation. The water vapor acts as a greenhouse gas, but it can never be increased in an artificial way. It only increases through evaporation, which is somewhat limited by your existing greenhouse effect. But water vapor does store heat. It's the latent heat of evaporation, and that water vapor releases its heat when it rains back into the atmosphere. So water vapor does contribute to the observation that the earth is warmer. The greenhouse effect, using just the CO2 and methane from the carbon cycle, was enough to make the planet, about 60 degrees warmer than it would be otherwise. We have been enhancing the greenhouse effect by burning fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are buried carbon. How did the carbon get buried? It got buried because plants were buried. And this is another path-dependent thing. The Earth had to be in a particular configuration for a long time for plants to be buried. This isn't currently happening in a particular way. There are enough organisms and conditions now to decay plants that the idea of burying plants and having them be there 300 years later is sort of a non-thing. There's lots of organisms now that specialize in just eating plants. As soon as the plant dies, a tree falls, whatever, it's attacked, and within 20 years, it's basically gone. So we're not burying plants anymore. That was something that happened 300 million years ago. It hasn't been happening too much since, and as a consequence, the fossil fuels from the buried plants have been able to bury a bunch of carbon out of the atmosphere a long time ago. And recently we've been digging it up. It's going back into the atmosphere. It will become part of the carbon cycle, but it spends a lot of time in the atmosphere. When it's not tied up in plants, it's in the atmosphere, and then it goes back into plants and animals, and then back into the atmosphere. So once it's out of the ground, you're kind of stuck with it. And you can be stuck with it for millions of years. The process of sequestering carbon is a long-term proposition. So every day that we burn 100 million barrels a day of oil, that's that number again, right? 100 million barrels per day. 100 million barrels, not liters, not gallons, barrels of oil daily. While we're doing that, we are enhancing the greenhouse effect. And the planet is getting hotter. And the heating of the planet causes a lot of problems. I'm not even going to go into it. It's everything. Everything breaks. Everything you thought you knew about the planet that would be sacred and eternal is coming unglued. And you're going to find that out. Scientists know that. Meteorologists know that. And if you get them alone and you put some beer in them and you get them to talk, they'll tell you how bad it is. I'm not going to bother. You're all going to find out eventually how bad it is. Even if you think you know how bad it is, you have no idea how bad it is. Actually, you just have no idea. You're not even close. It's really bad. In fact, it's lethal. It's lethal. And the enhancements to the greenhouse effect are going to be with us essentially forever. As far as human life on this planet is concerned, it's forever. We've only been here for 300,000 years, and almost certainly the greenhouse gases we're releasing into the atmosphere biosphere cycle will be still in the cycle 300,000 years from now. And will we be? Will we still be here puttering around digging up fossil fuels? I doubt it. Oh, we might be doing something. We might still be here, but we're not going to be puttering around digging up fossil fuels. That will have been way in the past. And why is that? Why does the fossil fuel era must have to come to an end and must come to an end and will come to an end shortly? Because we are about to make the planet uninhabitable for humans. Uninhabitable for humans. We are dependent on fossil fuels for life. We have created human habitat that is exclusive to humans. We share some of it with our domesticated animals, but for the most part, it's exclusive to humans. And we have built that out of fossil fuels by and large, or using fossil fuels in the construction processes of building houses and building bridges and building roads and building skyscrapers and innovating and lighting everything, electricity distribution and all the technology and all the everything. It's all done with fossil fuels. So when the planet becomes difficult and we suddenly realize that we have to stop this, we have to stop making it worse, because that's all we can do. I mean, maybe we can stop making it worse. We can never make it better. And almost nobody understands that. That's the truth. We can never make it better. Maybe we can stop making it worse. Maybe if we try to stop making it worse, it gets worse on its own because of things we did to set off a bunch of bombs that are going to blow up in our face. Right? The methane bomb, the Amazon bomb, the polar vortex bomb, the Greenland bomb, the doomsday glacier. Do we have to even call it a bomb? Right? These things have all been lit. The fuses are burning. That's what happened. They're all burning. All the fuses are lit. And we did that. The fuses are lit. We can't unlight them. It just doesn't work that way, folks. We are going to have to stop burning fossil fuels with immediate effect and then take our hit anyway. We're going to have to back away from this real fast. And I don't know who's going to pull the trigger. I don't know how we're going to do this. But at some point, fairly soon, we're just going to have to back away from what you're seeing in front of you. It's going to end. Now, it won't end for everybody. There's a secret for you. It will end for most people. The elites will still have their things. Now, they can't have everything, though, because you can't have an iPhone unless you're keeping your iPhone. Because an iPhone is manufactured in a factory at scale. And if there's only 8 million people who can afford an iPhone in the entire planet, does anyone make iPhones? Well, 8 million iPhones, that's still a lot of iPhones. So maybe they continue to make iPhones. Where's the factory for that? Where's the fossil fuels for that? Do we have an oil? Do we have an oil company that just makes sure that Apple Computer and TSMC and a bunch of other companies, 1,000 other companies, have the fossil fuels they need to keep going? I don't think so. I think that the thousands of parts that go into an iPhone and the thousands of factories have to run just don't. They just stop. The plastics, the metal, the machining, everything, it's all done in different places. Some of it's done in Malaysia, some of it's done in the Philippines, some of it's done in China, Taiwan, South Korea, America, Pakistan, India. And it all comes together in some factory someplace to assemble your iPhone. And that's just not going to work. And, not to put too fine a point on it, the transportation isn't going to work. You're not going to be able to get that component from Pakistan to Taiwan where your iPhone is assembled. We just won't allow fossil fuels to be used for that. So unless iPhones actually grow on trees, unlikely, you're not going to have them. No one will have them. Because the scale at which these things that you just take for granted, the scale at which these things happen, cannot happen anymore. Cannot be maintained. It's as simple as that. We have to abandon the fossil fuels. And as soon as we do, this modernity, everything, all of it, the electricity, the plastics, the internet, the routers and the switches and everything on the internet, and the electricity that runs all those things, not just my electricity, all the electricity, all of it. And it's coming from natural gas, and it's coming from burning coal, and it has to be distributed across all these wires, and the wires have to be maintained, and they fall out all the time, and it takes copious applications of fossil fuels to maintain these lines, and the lines need linemen and line trucks and equipment and communications, and all this stuff has to still be there. And what happens when it isn't there anymore? Because no fossil fuels. And all this complexity and all this built up bullshit and all this, 150 years, more like 50 years of just building and building and building and building comes crashing down. Not because I said so, or because Nostradamus said so, or because, the book of Daniel predicts it so, or whatever, John of Patmos decided, Paul of Patmos, whatever it was, John of Patmos decided it was going to be that way in his book of Revelations. No, it comes crashing down because it's supported with energy and products that come from, in particular, crude oil, derivative products. And without fossil fuels, you can't have these things. And the whole thing comes crashing down. Oh, and by the way, without fossil fuels, in particular natural gas and oil, you can't grow the food in the capacity that we grow it currently. So the population comes crashing down. And it doesn't have to take very long for that to happen. That little shit show could be a year or two. Now, they're not going to be serious about stopping fossil fuel consumption. Just face it, they're not going to be serious about that for the reasons I just outlined. I mean, do you think I'm the only person who figured this out? Do you think I'm the only person who looked at this chart? Do you think I'm the only person who looked at this chart? You think I'm the only person who can put these two charts together? Seriously? There are thousands of people on this planet that look at these two charts, and the first time they looked at them, they understood what was happening. Thousands of people. And then they went out and taught thousands, tens of thousands more. I can promise you, that except for Vladimir Putin and maybe Chairman Z, every leader on the planet knows this chart and its implications and why it happened, and this chart and its implications and why it happened. Every world leader knows these things. So when they come together and they have their IPCC conference and they have their COP conference and their other COP conference, and when they get together to talk about our problems with fossil fuels and the greenhouse effect and global heating, and they know all this. And when they're frank among each other, when they've had some wine or some beer and they're sitting around belly aching and complaining about their problem, when they're frank with each other, they'll say, yeah, we're kind of screwed because we can't stop doing this. So they won't stop. They won't stop this. They won't go back to this. They are going to keep doing all of this, which is basically this chart here. They're going to keep doing this for as long as they possibly can. There will be no talk of ending this. There will be no talk of ending this mountain of energy. There will be no talk of that. There will be no talk about how we get back to running civilization on this. That conversation will never take place anywhere on the planet. I'm not even going to have that conversation. And the reason why I can't have that conversation either is because it can't be done. If all you really have is traditional biomass, wood, and maybe a couple of other energy sources like wind, running windmills for pumping and grinding grain, and wind captured by sails to move ships, and a couple of other wind things, and a couple of other falling water things, like you can run a mill off of falling water, right? Oh, you can float a boat on rivers, right? You could take advantage of a river to float a boat downstream. And so apart from these kinds of things, these natural energy sources that we can just use, just use, and have used for thousands of years. There are windmills, used for pumping water. They go back to the Roman times. falling water, aqueducts, all these kinds of things. We could harness these things. But that's basically just a little bit more than this brown line right here. And the rest of the stack that's grayed out, that's shadowed out, just goes away. And they're never going to do that. They're never going to do that. They're never going to do that. If they did that, there would be at least a 90% die-off of the human species. Which sounds like a lot. That's a big number. Wow, 90% die-off. Whew, isn't that extinction? No, not even close. In fact, if we had 10% of the current population would still be 800 million people. There are so many people on Earth that if you only had 10% of the current population, you'd still have more than 2 United States populations. That's a lot of people. 2 whole United States and more. That's 10% of the current population. The problem is, if you don't have fossil fuels, given the state of the world as it is now, the planet, I'm talking about the actual planet, you couldn't stop the die-off at 90%. I am extremely confident that without the rest of the stack, relying only on wood for fuel and materials, of which there is not much wood, by the way, on this planet right now, not around where I live, we would have a 99% die-off of people. 99%. There's 1 million people in the town where I live right now. There's maybe 2 million in the South Bay. I'd have to look it up, but it doesn't matter. 2 million people. I could promise you that without modernity, 2 million people could not survive here. I'm not sure how many people could survive. We have a couple of natural waterways that are still natural, but not many. Where I live, I guess it's Coyote Creek and the Guadalupe River, which have water in them a lot of the time. The Guadalupe River kind of is a river. It's small, you can walk across it, but it runs all year long, unless there's a real drought. It runs all year long, so it is technically a river. You can walk across it almost any time of the year. You can walk or swim across it. It's tiny. But it does establish a natural corridor. And there might be things along the river you could eat. And there might be materials like willows that you could use to make baskets and mats and homes. You could weave willows into structures. And within the water, there will be fish and other animals like seasonal ducks and geese that you could trap, perhaps if you were clever. So because we do have a river here, and it does flow mostly year-round, and there is a somewhat natural habitat for a short length of it. The rest of it, by the way, has been channelized, and they've built homes right up to the edge of the river, and then the river drops off inside of a concrete channel. Much of which could be reversed by nature, by the way. So maybe some of the river starts to come back on its own when the maintenance stops, right? But there's a short section where it is still somewhat natural, not too crowded, and it's a riparian corridor with trees and some other things. And I imagine that riparian corridor could support not 2 million people, but maybe 200. 200. So what is that? Is that like 1/10 of 1% of the population? I'm not going to take that phone call. Yeah, like 200 people. A small tribe, right? A small tribe. And this area probably would have had several small tribes living in it. And they'd be hunting in the marshes, and they'd be hunting in the bay, fishing in the bay. They had probably small rafts. They could go out and catch fish and come back. And there were deer, but there's none of those things now. There's nothing like that now. And this little riparian corridor, this little green belt on the Guadalupe River, which is not much of a river, you can walk across it most of the year, that could support maybe 200 people, maybe not even 200, maybe 80, maybe 50. I got to be careful here. Maybe 20, 30 people could live on that part of the Guadalupe River. So this 2 million people, and this is like the beating heart of Silicon Valley. So much money here. Houses cost upwards of a $1.5 million a piece. So much wealth, so much innovation, so much advancement, so much the heart of modern industrialized civilization without fossil fuels, of which we are currently consuming 100 million barrels a day of oil alone, right? Oil alone, which is maybe a third of what we're consuming. Just the oil alone is 100 million barrels of oil a day. Without that, every single fucking day, then this entire built environment, this entire built human habitat collapses into useless concrete and asphalt, which can't even support deer. Animals can't even live here unless they get into people's backyards. There's nothing here for them. Maybe 50 people can live here on just whatever is available on the riparian habitat of the Guadalupe River. 20, maybe 50 people. Not a joke. Not a joke. Not joking at all. That is not extinction, by the way. That's not even extirpation. Extirpation is local extinction. That's not even extirpation. But I can guarantee you there will be lots of places around here that no people could live. People could not live. They could live maybe near the ocean and mostly on fish and where there's any natural habitat at all. Or maybe there's materials like willows or, clay or, where the fresh water running into the ocean. Maybe some people could live at these places, but the entire population of the Bay Area, which is 7 million people, it'd probably be down to 7,000. That's like maybe 1%? 7 million, 700, no, that's like 0.1%. 7,000 people is 0.1%. And now that sounds pretty dire. I mean, it's like, how did he come up with that? I just know what resources are available. I live here. I know what the resources are. I know how bad the habitat, what shape the habitat is in. It's bad. It's really bad. Probably 2/3 of the Guadalupe River has been completely cemented for flood control purposes. It's bad. It's really bad, people. And when you look at the Bay Area from space, it's one huge scab of asphalt and concrete. There used to be, arable land here. Under this concrete, the dirt is 3-4 feet thick. I mean, that's the good dirt. That's the black soil, the black loam. It's 3 feet deep under all this asphalt and concrete. You can't get to it now. And without power tools and heavy equipment, you can't get to it later. It's gone. It's just gone forever. It'll take nature 100,000 years to clear this mess up. 100,000 years. It'll take that long to erode the concrete. Slowly, slowly, slowly. The rain just finally erodes it away. And then there's just the gravel left. And the gravel is, be a thick layer of gravel on top of this loam. But you could get to the loam at that point. And nature could get to the loam. So you'd have willows and you'd have marshlands and you'd have oaks and you'd have, and since there's a lot of introduced plants here, you'd have avocados and who knows what all growing in the South Bay. And it could be a really nice habitat for people. That's going to take 20, 30,000 years. That's a long haul without fossil fuels. And if all you've got left is a tribe of 50 people living in the riparian habitat of the Guadalupe River, one disease, one fire, one outbreak, one really clever predator, and that predator could even be humans, right? Could just kill them. All of them, down to nothing. And then you have an extirpation event. And if that happens in enough places in the world where it's just so marginal, just so little is left of the natural habitat, almost nothing left. If that happens in enough places, then you may have extirpations, local extinctions, that cover entire continents. All humans in Africa could go extinct because it's just so difficult to live there. It's been so torn up, so damaged. People have just forgotten how to survive, and there's too many people. And they go through a period of warfare and essentially cannibalism, and nearly all of them die. The same thing could happen in parts of Europe. Just no humans left. They just all die. And here in the South Bay, where there's probably $100 billion worth of real estate, there could be 500 people left in the South Bay alone, scattered around among all the different disparate places where humans can actually live without fossil fuels. Now, again, they're not going to do that. They're not going to turn them off because they know that. They understand this chart and they understand this chart. They understand these things. They're never going to turn it off. They're never going to turn it off. Nevertheless, it's going to be turned off. And this is where I have to make a distinction between how civilization ends. It ends one of two ways. Either because we choose to end it on our terms and take our hit and try and maintain as much technology and innovation as we can, and of course people, or we don't deliberately do that work and we simply allow it to go willy-nilly. And the distinction I like to make is between a controlled demolition in the first case and an uncontrolled demolition in the second case. There is no path that does not pass through a point I'm calling demolition. All pathways pass through that point. Now, you can take a path of controlled demolition and you stop burning fossil fuels and you learn how to survive without them, and whatever technology you get, whatever innovation you can maintain, whatever types of medical care or agriculture or communications tech or anything else you can maintain without fossil fuels, then you figure it out and you do it deliberately because that's the work of the moment. Or you don't do those things. And then you get an uncontrolled demolition and you get what you get, which is probably nothing, which is probably, like I said, the green belt around the Guadalupe River and 20 to 50 people living in a tribe dressing themselves in animal skins. No joke. No joke. Now, what does a controlled demolition look like? Well, a controlled demolition. Governments could do this for us, and that's why it's not going to happen. Governments could do this for us, but they don't want that. So we can't have that. What would it look like? It would look like projects to help communities become more resilient and more hyper-local. You would have to be able to get to your food, basically walk to the fields. You would have to be able to walk to a source of water. You would need enough people in your population to have a viable breeding population of different people with different skills. You would need enough people to be able to support specialists. So carpenters to work with wood, healers, people to make pots and tools and things out of clay and metal and recycling metal. You need people who can work with plants, people who can work with animals. You would need a tanner, the ability to tan hides because you need the leather. It's a natural resource. And of course, you need seeds and you need tools and you need techniques and you need knowledge. So the governments can help us become small communities working together with local leadership, local decision making, and immediate access to the resources we need to pull that off. The governments could have an intermediate phase where they continue to provide electricity, tap water, take away waste products, right? Sewer systems and also garbage collection. Not that you should have much of the latter. You really should be using every single thing. And if you've got food scraps, then you need pigs. And if you got more food scraps and you got pigs, then you need more pigs, okay? And if you don't like the idea of having pigs, well, shut up. That's what you have to do. You should have no garbage. You kind of can't help having sewer. And if you have tap water, then flushing toilets and sewer treatment, maybe that's a thing. So maybe the governments can provide us with basic utilities. And hey, what about this? Maybe the governments working together can keep the internet running. And I don't mean the server farms that are crunching Bitcoin and working on AI and all that bullshit. I mean just basic communications on the internet. Email, websites, Google searches, or whatever it becomes at that point. because we probably can't have Google as a corporation. Instead, we just have whatever Google left behind, right? There's certain capabilities that continue to work for a while, and the government has enough technical people to keep the internet working and and keep the websites up that we think we need. Or maybe you have a version of Google, maybe you have a version of the internet, let's just say the internet, that runs on a local server. And you have your local server, and it's provided by the government, and it's, probably some of my servers I have left over from my career as a developer could serve a local version of the internet. I'm not even a joke, right? How much do you really need? All of Wikipedia, all of YouTube. I mean, what are we talking about here? So the governments working together could coordinate a contraction, a phased contraction down to what I just described, which we can encapsulate with the word village life. It's not medieval village life, and it's not village life in backwoods India or backwoods China. These could be with a controlled demolition managed by governments, and of course the governments are being demolished too, right? We don't need planning departments anymore. We don't even need a mayor. We don't need a city council. We just need basically technical people with a budget that can do some technical things and just keep things running. And maybe power wouldn't be available 24/7, but hey, if a transformer blew up, maybe within a couple of weeks someone could come out and replace the transformer. Maybe it would take a month, but it doesn't matter, right? So for a month you do without, so for a month you do with less, and eventually you're okay. And they fix it for you, and they keep doing that. But we're shrinking, we're getting smaller. And eventually the power going out for a week or two at a time might not even matter, might not even be noticeable. So long as the tap water's still there, and I flush my toilet and the sewer treatment plant still works, then maybe I don't even notice that there's no power. Maybe the internet goes down when there's no power, but maybe I haven't used the internet for anything of importance in a couple of months, so I don't even notice. That you'd like to be at that point. If you've done this controlled demolition in the right way and in the right order, you might get to a point where you don't need these things anymore. Or you have enough local resources that you can get by. Local electricity, what would that be? Solar, right? Inverters, battery storage. That's local. You have it on your rooftops. You could have the battery stored in a vault somewhere, and you could have your own electricity. Maybe it's not as good as the grid, but hey, if the grid goes down, you've got enough electricity, you can do minimal things. And eventually, if the grid is down for 3-4 months, then you get by on minimal things, and you just abandon those other things because you can't have them anymore. And the governments can make sure that these villages, for lack of a better word, can have solar power. And the governments would also have to make sure that these villages have access to fields. So the governments could, if we established a village in a particular location, say a bunch of houses or a bunch of blocks together, they create their walls, they create their interior, they organize themselves, and then the government could come in with their heavy equipment. Well, we'll burn the last of the fossil fuels during our controlled demolition. The government comes in with a bunch of heavy equipment, and they tear down the other buildings. Maybe you save the wood, right? That's a good idea. Maybe demolish the buildings in a controlled way, take the wood and the nails away and the other things, appliances, air conditioners, whatever. Store those someplace nearby. And then the government comes in with their heavy equipment, and they tear up the foundations, they tear up the roads, they tear up the concrete and you get the dirt. And like I say, the dirt is here. You dig very deep in this soil around here, you find beautiful black loam. So just a little bit of work, some heavy equipment, pile this stuff up into a pile and set fire to it if there's anything left, if you didn't actually salvage all of it, or pile the concrete up, and people later on can use the concrete like we use marble and limestone. You can build walls with it. So pile the concrete up, save it for later. And there's iron in there too, by the way. And you break the concrete up, you get the iron out, the reinforcement bar, and you can melt that down later and make things out of it. So you could recycle practically your entire community that isn't your village. And then the land is available. And so you start working the land. And what do you do with the land? Well, you plant wheat and barley, and you have orchards, and maybe you have some pasture land, and you put your animals out on the pasture, and therefore you can have cattle for milk and dairy, and you can have horses to ride and to do work. and every household has its own chickens and pigs for waste disposal. Chickens are great for disposing of waste. You throw them an apple peel, and boy, they take that thing down to nothing. And chickens and pigs, maybe one dairy cow per household if they want that, and the rest of it is communal, right? It's community resource. And then you're taught how to manage these resources. You have access to the internet for a while to learn how to do these things. And pretty soon you're breeding your own animals, and you're managing your pasture, and you're putting up fence, and you're keeping the other animals out, the wild animals out. And eventually, the rivers become wild, and the streams return, and they become wild, and the concrete becomes eroded, and pretty soon you can go down to the river for fish and beavers, and the beavers for their pelts, and you could have ducks. You have ducks in a pond, and you could go to the river and down to the streams and catch the ducks that are wild. And the deer would return, and you could hunt the venison. And what would you hunt the venison with? Well, maybe you have guns and bullets, but maybe you decide that it's not sustainable. So you learn how to make bows, and you learn how to make the parts for a bow. And you reinvent archery. And you use a little bit of the metal you've been saving, and you forge arrowheads. And then you go hunting deer for venison. And maybe the government's deliberately reintroduced species that are now locally extinct. Elk and deer, and maybe in some places bison, and rabbits and foxes, and who knows what all. And so very slowly, with the government assistance and everyone working together in a controlled demolition, ratcheting down our dependence on modernity, we slowly, inevitably, purposefully, deliberately rebuild something that can survive without fossil fuels, because those are going away. And at the same time that the fossil fuels are going away, the planet is becoming more violent. Global heating did not go away. We've created a certain amount of that, and we're stuck with it. The CO2 in the atmosphere and the methane did not go away. We created a certain amount of that, and we're stuck with it. And whatever we're stuck with is what we're stuck with. And we're stuck with it for hundreds of thousands of years. So at the same time that we are learning how to be more localized and interdependent with each other, and not dependent on Starbucks and Target and Costco, right? Dependent on the land, dependent on the seasons, dependent on the sun, dependent on the wind, dependent on the rain. Not on Target and Costco and Whole Foods. The weather's going to be getting worse because of global heating. And so some of these villages may find themselves simply not viable. Gave it our best, gave it our best shot. The government helped us as much as they could. Fossil fuels were dwindling. They were becoming less available, more expensive. We used them like a precious resource. And eventually, at the end of that road, we just couldn't make it work. And so you'll have to emigrate to some place where it is working. And will those people take you in? Yeah, they probably would. Provided you're willing to work the fields and pound the iron and dig up the stone and make the walls and grind the grains and harvest the things and protect the granaries and fend off the enemies of civilization and all these things. As long as you're willing to do that, you can probably emigrate to a village that is in a good place. And so maybe, the human population collapses to 8 million people globally, which is 1/10 of 1% of the current population, which, remember, was kind of my estimate for what this area right here could support in an uncontrolled demolition. Maybe 1/10 of 1% of the current population could actually live here in this concrete jungle without government assistance and no planning. So eventually, maybe the whole world comes down to 1/10 of 1% of the current world population. But, hey, maybe they've got some technology. Maybe they've got medicine. Maybe they've got a lot of things because they did it in a controlled way. Or we could just keep doing what we're doing. And if we keep doing what we're doing, the world is going to spin up. So much energy and so much violence. And the weather's going to get so bad. And the heat waves are going to get so bad, so hot, that the surface of the earth becomes uninhabitable. And then the only people who can survive on the earth, and there'll always be people, will be the ultra wealthy. And where will they be? See my earlier work. They'll be living below the sea. They'll be living actually in the sky. Easily done. They'll be living on mountaintops where the weather can be, more acceptable. Or they'll be living underground where the weather is basically kept at bay. So people will not be living on the surface of the earth. It'll be too hot. Uninhabitable earth. You can't live on the surface. You can live in these other places. And the ultra wealthy will figure that out because they have the money and the political pull to figure that out for themselves. And they will figure that out for themselves. And there will be villages, small towns, small cities of ultra wealthy people living probably just however they want to live, right? There's so few of them, they can actually burn all the fossil fuels they want to, and likely will. But the rest of us will be done. And how many people will that be? I don't know. 800,000? Maybe 800,000, maybe 1 million. An uncontrolled demolition leaves us with all the Musks and the Bezoses and the Gates and all of their sycophants living in their castles in the sky, literally actual castles in the actual sky, looking down on us while we revert to cannibalism, actual cannibalism, and they don't want to be down here with us. So they're on Mars, and they're on the moon, and they're in space, and they're in castles in the sky. And they're looking down on us and watching us with telescopes until we're all gone. And the Earth is still too hot to live on. So they can't live on the surface of the Earth because it's too fucking hot. And if you don't understand that, well, fuck you. I can't explain it to you. It's physics. 10 degrees C above baseline is going to murder everyone. This is going to make this planet uninhabitable for anything, nearly any form of life. I mean, scorpions and rattlesnakes will be able to survive on the surface of this planet. That's it. Do we get a controlled demolition? Oh man, I hope so. I hope so. That's the only way I'm going to be able to survive it. I'm 65 years old. I have no business talking about when I'm going to survive. Yeah, this could happen soon enough that for me, this is a problem. It really could. And in fact, the uncontrolled demolition, where we make no changes of any kind and simply keep doing what we're doing, and we go from 100 million barrels of oil a day extracted to 120 and 140, and we just keep accelerating and biggering and going further and further and further into this existential hell, and then the civilization collapses. It's just too much. Too much violence, too much damage, too many hurricanes, too many tornadoes, too much heat, too many floods, too many everything. It's just one thing and then it's another, and then that first thing comes back, and you get pounded from all directions because the planet's got spun up and can't spin itself down. It never will. It'll be 1 million years before this planet reverts to anything similar to what we have now. If we just go business as usual, uncontrolled demolition. Will humans go extinct? I don't think so. But there might be 8,000 humans left on Earth. 1% of 1% of 1% of the current population. Yeah, there might be 8,000 people. 80,000 left on Earth. The ultra wealthy living in castles in the actual sky. I don't want to have to explain that to you. Well, I've gone on long enough. My point is, this cannot continue. This show is over. We can't continue doing this. And we can either opt for a controlled demolition, as I described it, where we deliberately build sustainable villages that are resilient and hopefully are located in the right place, or we can just hold our nose and wait for the bad thing to happen. Whatever it is, whatever that turns out to be. Hypercanes, scouring entire continents down to the bedrock. I have no idea. I have no idea what's coming. Oh, I just mentioned something. We could also have fires, just fires that just burn all the time. It's just so hot that the fires start spontaneously. The whole city's on fire until everything is burned, including the people and the animals and the buildings and the trees. Everything just gets burned. It's just so hot. And every time you spark a fire, it just burns out of control until everything is burned. All of our cities might burn, especially the ones that are made out of wood. And where do those people go? And when they're roaming the earth, they're looking for food, clothing, shelter, security, water. And that destroys the world too, because these people are just roaming the earth, taking whatever they can take, desperate. Not evil, not even angry, just desperate. They have no plan. And in an uncontrolled demolition, their plan will be to survive. Because that's all you can expect of people, is that they'll fight to survive. And the whole thing could come crashing down as everyone fights to survive. That's an uncontrolled demolition. Wow. So we're either going to get a controlled demolition and kind of cross our fingers and hope for the best. And, we can actually have some influence over how that works out. So it's not just hoping for the best, it's planning for the best, to get the best, planning to make this work. Or we get an uncontrolled demolition. And maybe the uncontrolled demolition happens later so we can party on a little longer like we're doing now. We have this big party. Lasts maybe 10 years, maybe on the outside 20, but then it all comes down anyway. And the only people who survive at that point are the ultra wealthy. And they can't even survive on the surface of the earth because it's uninhabitable. I don't know. But as I said before, there's only two pathways, or these two pathways in some combination. But whatever pathway you take, or the two in combination, all pathways pass through a point called demolition. And you can take the pathway of controlled demolition and think about how you're going to do this and plan for it and execute your plan. Or you can take the path of uncontrolled demolition, which does have the advantage of making no decisions and having a great party, whatever time you have and whatever party you're allowed to have, whatever party you want to have. You have fossil fuels, do whatever you want, right? Go nuts. And then you pass through demolition. All pathways lead to demolition. And you have to understand that, because we have to give up on fossil fuels. We have to do that because of the greenhouse effect. And fossil fuels gave us everything we have. So that makes giving up on them scary. But it doesn't matter. You have to give up on them anyway. Because an uncontrolled demolition is a frightful thing. Frightful. Possibly lethal. Not that a controlled demolition is going to be some kind of a party. But at least if you grab the situation and you work with your peers and you work with the government and you engage in a controlled demolition, you are empowered. You have agency. And even in the end, if it doesn't work, you can congratulate yourself for having tried. I know that's a dim view and that's poor comfort. Nevertheless, you will have that. If you choose a controlled demolition, which every single person can start right now, by the way, you can start making yourself free of fossil fuels. And if there's hardships or there's difficulties or you have to surrender your precious little things, things you thought that were just yours by right and that you had to have just to be able to survive every day, like your drive up window at the Starbucks to get your latte. That was so special to you. It's the only way you can start your day. Well, actually, you don't have to have that. There's a lot of things you don't have to have. And as you cut back on your fossil fuel consumption, you won't be able to have them. And you'll have to do more things for yourself. And if you want a latte, maybe you'll have to learn how to steam your own milk and make your own espresso. And if you want to steam your own milk, maybe you need a supply of milk of your own. You have to keep a dairy cow. How are you going to do that? How can you do that in the city? Do you need to have some kind of arrangement with your city? Well, now you're arguing with your city council. I need to have a dairy cow. I need to have a goat at least so I can have milk to make my latte in the morning so I can go to work. See, you just have to plow through it. And village life will be like that. It'll be all these compromises. And maybe someone figures out how to grow coffee beans. And you have a coffee harvest. And you roast the coffee beans somehow. And you learn how to do that. And then you can have ground coffee. And there are certain times of the year when you can actually have, an espresso. And if you've got goats or sheep or dairy cows, you can have steamed milk. And then you can have a latte. And you did all this. You figured this all out. And now you've got a latte and you can't have one every day before you go to work. But that's okay because you're not going anywhere. Your work is your backyard. Your work is your front yard. Your work is your community. You're going to work in the fields, which are right across the street, just literally across the asphalt, which is constantly degrading, of course, full of potholes. Just cross the street and go out into the field and work the field, pull the weeds, right? Herd the cattle, herd the sheep, shear the sheep. That's your work. You're not going anywhere. Then a couple of times a year, there's enough ground coffee that we can all have a latte. And so we'll do that. Yeah, that could be your life. But that's your life. You made that life. You made that happen. You made that happen. And when the axe falls and the fossil fuels are gone for all practical purposes, then you've got a life. And you made it for yourself. And you started today. You started right here with this video. And you took it seriously. And you went back and you watched it again. And you considered all the elements that I've discussed. And you think about what's necessary and what's critical and what you'll have to throw away. And what's it going to look like when we lose 99% of the population? How's that going to play out? What's that going to look like? What's it going to smell like? What's it going to sound like? Think about it. And what side of that coin do you want to be on? When you flip that coin, how do you want that to come up? Where are you going to be? Are you going to be inside the walls listening? Or are you going to be outside the walls dying? You have agency. You can maybe figure that out. Or maybe not. Maybe not. But maybe yes or maybe not. It's up to you and your community. You and your community, and maybe, if you can get any support, your local government, city, maybe county. You, your community, maybe your local government. Maybe you can figure that out. And if you can, and you can make it happen, then that's your life. You made that. You made that. You made that happen. That's yours. You own that. And you deserve it. And when you have that life and you have those people and you know who your community is and you know what your job is and you know what you have to do every day and you know you have the means of survival, that's yours. You made that happen. It's shared, but that's okay. You made it happen. That, I think, is the work of the moment. Controlled demolition. That is the work of the moment. Will we do it? I think some people will. Some people will figure it out. Some people will have the combination of intelligence, education, and resources, and awareness. Just basically global awareness and awareness of the science and the willingness to face it with a stiff upper lip, just to face it. And those people with those combination of traits and resources can figure this out. Everyone else is going to die. And they're going to die never knowing, never understanding what happened to them. Well, that's enough for me. I got other things to do. This is 2 hours long. It's a long topic. I don't think I'll be doing this very often. I hope it was worthwhile for you. I hope you got something out of it. If I overlooked something, leave a comment. Maybe food for thought. Also, use the comments to start thinking about community life. Use the comment section on this video to start saying what you would have to have, what you would be willing to bring, what skills do you have. Pretend that this is how the movement begins, right here with this video, on this comment section. This is where we start it. It starts with me, but then it goes to you, and the ball is in your court. What can you do? What do you need? What can you not live without? Prove to me, prove to everyone else that you can't live without that. And if it's true, and lots of people agree, then that's something we have to save. For you, for us, for me, and that becomes the basis of the conversation. That becomes the work of the moment. The things we know we can't live without. It's 1,000 things, by the way. It's 1,000 things that you need to pull this off. A controlled demolition. You need 1,000 things. You need to solve 1,000 problems. I alluded to many of them in this video. One of them is getting your government on board. Another one is creating a community. Before you create a community, you have to convince your neighbors that you've got a problem. And then you have to get the government to, you have to empty all these houses and businesses, and you have to start demolishing these buildings and pulling up this asphalt and concrete. There's 1,000 things you have to do. You have to reintroduce domestic animals, all the ones you can possibly manage. And you have to reintroduce the means of managing them. Where's the pasture? And do we have veterinarians? How do you breed animals? Do you even know? Do you have to have barns, fences? What's it take? What if the wolves return? What if foxes eat all your chickens? What are you going to do? There's 1,000 problems you have to fix. There's 1,000 problems you have to address and find solutions for to form a village that's going to be resilient and self-reliant. 1,000 things. Doesn't include the internet, doesn't include electricity, doesn't include tap water, because those are things you can't fix. Governments have to fix those things. They have 1,000 things they have to fix. 1,000 things they have to be willing to keep rolling forward. Can they do that? Can you convince them to do that? Do they know that they have to do that? Does the city council know we don't need a city council? Does the mayor know we don't need a mayor? We need technical people. We need technicians. We need resources. We need transformers. We need wire. We need to be able to fix things when they break. The water comes from 100 miles away. How can we keep that going? What's it going to take? If we can't, then we need water locally. That's a problem to fix. And that one problem is another 1,000 problems to fix. Just having local water, drilling wells, having pumps, having storage. That's a 100 or 1,000 things to fix. Just to have local water that doesn't come 200 miles away. It's a long list. It's incredible. It all has to be done. It all has to be done. And it starts here. It starts here. Knowing that it has to be done. I'm done. I'm tired. I got other things to do. I've always got other things to do. My God. When will I have time